Telefunken kit R199, 1959. This is the documentation of the experience of a hobby project, made with the hope that it could be helpful to others. However, these videos are not intended as tutorials. They only show the development of a personal practice, which may or may not be a good one. Therefore, if you are following along, you are doing so at your own risk. This radio was found in Italy, donated by a friend who received it from another friend. It must have been used a lot, and the dial scale seems scratched on purpose, probably to remember the location of two important radio stations. This model was manufactured in Italy around 1959, designed to be very cheap. In particular, instead of a variable capacitor, it uses two variable inductors, moved in synchrony through a dedicated cord, connected to the dial pulley. The electrical part of the radio is built mostly on a printed circuit board, but the high-frequency components, coils, trimmer capacitors, and band switch, are mounted on a metal frame and are built in place without using a separable module. The radio has a power autotransformer, and the chassis is always hot, as long as the power plug is connected to the mains. The radio seems to be intact and never serviced before. This is the original schematic diagram found online at umberto-alessio.it, with additional annotations to guide the interpretation. This is a ray-written and simplified schematic diagram, where instead of the band switch, the different components involved in each band are annotated as if they were separable modules. This radio uses a potentiometer R16 with an additional tap for improving the bass at low volume. There is also a negative feedback connection between the volume control and the loudspeaker. The audio output transformer, T3, has a primary winding with an intermediate connection, L, so that the DC current feeding the final amplifier tube, terminal K, goes in the opposite direction compared to the current feeding the other tube anodes, terminal M. This is done with the purpose of canceling the hum from the loudspeaker, which would otherwise be generated by the ripple in the B+ line after the rectifier tube. This radio contains three hybrid modules. One of them appears to have a single component out of value. The faulty hybrid module is removed and replaced with equivalent discrete components. After the faulty hybrid has been replaced, the paper and electrolytic capacitors are also replaced. Checking one capacitor with a value that should be of 47 nanofarads, a much higher value is read instead, very likely because there is a significant electrical leakage inside. The radio is finally recapped, and also the loudspeaker is now separable with the help of a spade connector. This radio uses two variable inductors in place of a variable capacitor. The cores of these variable inductors are moved with a cord attached to the same pulley that is connected to the dial cord. It is advisable to avoid tampering with the variable inductor cord because replacing it would be complicated. The actual dial cord could be easily replaced instead, and in this case, some fishing wire is used for the purpose. Special care should be given to the spring keeping the dial cord in tension. It is soldered to the plastic pulley, and it should not be removed from the pulley itself. The antenna connection is modified so that a loop antenna could be attached. Two safety capacitors are used, one replacing the original antenna capacitor, the other one for the connection with the chassis to avoid exposing the operator to electrocution. There is no information available over the correct alignment for the IF transformers for this particular radio model. Considering that other Telefunken models of the same period were using the frequency of 468 kHz, this value has been used also for the radio under restoration. With the band selector set to medium wave and the cores of the tuning coils completely inserted for tuning to the lowest frequency, the signal is applied to the antenna input, and then the IF transformers are aligned to get the maximum signal output. The unit should be powered exclusively using an isolation transformer so that the chassis could be connected to the same ground of the signal generator and other pieces of equipment. The intensity of the signal could be measured from the AGC line, seeking for the most negative voltage. The alignment between the tuning section and the oscillator section requires the adjustment of trimmer capacitors and inductors that are mounted on the structure that is already holding the variable inductor couple. With the unit under restoration, it appeared impossible to align perfectly the reception to the dial scale. Therefore, for every band, the alignment has been made only for a frequency around the middle of the scale, adjusting the components to get the maximum output signal. First of all, the medium wave band should be aligned, adjusting L4, L1, C5, and C12. For the 50-meter band, L3, C6, C8 could be adjusted. For the 25-meter band, nothing should be done. This radio model has been designed focusing on making it cheap. There is no shielding between the first three vacuum tubes, and all the coils involved in the tuning and oscillator sections are not shielded either. Under the circumstances, these parts are exposed to reciprocal and external interference. In the hope of obtaining a slight improvement in the performance of the radio, the first three tubes are shielded using aluminum foil connected to the radio chassis with a tinted wire. For a better result, also the internal side of the cabinet could be shielded with aluminum foil connected to the chassis ground, but that has not been tried in this restoration project. The unit was donated to a friend who was willing to adopt it. But 4 years later, due to lack of space, he asked to return it so that it could be donated to someone else. This can be an occasion for introducing better safety measures after having gained a little more experience. Therefore, the unit returns on the bench. When restoring a live chassis radio, if an isolation transformer cannot be added, the typical modification to make is moving the switch to the hot side so that the chassis remains connected to the neutral line. But for making sure that the chassis is actually connected to the neutral line, another important modification is necessary in order to warn the user in case of an incorrect orientation of the power plug. Therefore, here is the modification that will be made to this unit. A small project box will be used to house fuses and a circuit including a buzzer. This buzzer will activate if there is a significant voltage differential between the neutral line and the external ground. In other words, the buzzer will sound if the supposed neutral line is actually the hot line. The following accelerated clips show the process of making this circuit and populating the project box. The buzzer circuit works. The box is completed. As it has been shown during the process, the power cord enters the box first, reaching the fuses. Only after the fuses there is the connection to the radio. Moreover, the buzzer circuit is hidden in the box, but the buzzer element remains outside of it. Here is what one should expect. If the buzzer sounds, the power plug is inserted with the wrong orientation and operating the radio is too dangerous. Other minor but not less important changes are made, starting from rerouting the power switch to the hot line, as described in the previous section. Then, to avoid useless troubles, the input voltage selector is disconnected from all the power transformer taps that are not useful anymore. In the end, only the input for 220 volts remains selectable. The antenna input returns in the way that it was originally a single wire because the performance of a loop antenna proved to be very poor with this radio. For a better stable connection of the wire antenna, an additional tag strip is installed. Before putting the chassis back in the cabinet, a last visual scan under and above the chassis is in order. The chassis is ready to get in the cabinet. First, the small safety box should be installed so that the chassis could be put on top. Also, the dial glass should not be forgotten. Despite all the safety measures, one cannot take for granted that the chassis will always be safe. Therefore, some care should also be given to the knobs for making sure that they will not become loose too easily. For this reason, the original set screws are replaced with new ones, with an hexagonal insert at the top that would allow to tighten them more effectively. Even when the chassis is finally in the cabinet, there is still another thing that can be done for improving the safety: installing a power plug with a switch. It would be important to acquire the habit to turn on and off the radio from the external switch. This way, provided that the switch works correctly, there would be no safety hazard while the radio is turned off. However, without this external switch, it would always be possible and advisable to unplug the radio when not used. In this final test, the meter is connected between the external electrical ground and the chassis. When the buzzer remains silent, the chassis has a very low voltage differential compared to ground, and it may be safe. However, the buzzer will be able to produce an alarm only if the plug is inserted in a power outlet that has an effective ground connection. If there is no functioning ground connection for whatever reason, or if there is a failure in the power cord connection, the chassis could become live, which means deadly, and the buzzer would remain silent. The radio is now ready for a new home, and this is the final test, done in the evening, starting with the medium wave band, ending with the last short wave band.
آنها در برابر نقض حقوق شهروندان منفعل نشدند. سینا یوسفی، وکیل و پژوهشگر حقوق بین‌الملل ساکن آلمان، در گفتگو با رادیو فردا. این سرکوب وکلا en particulier, par exemple, pour les fruits, c'est très nécessaire à faire des pressions pour les fruits qui vont les maintenir au frais, les maintenir. از آرش تا حسین ستارخان با سلام و آرزوی
一直廠商不斷咁使用，佢哋係國家嘅一級文物，製作年代係清朝中期，而仲有一啲咧係國家嘅三級文。
و همین
من فاطمه و احساس استیقاظی که دارم رو که خط مشترکشون تمام این پیام ها